Realism is an artistic movement that took place from 1840 to the late 19th century. This movement was highly controversial because of the themes it suggested, but it was also famous for its unique style. Realism rejected classical forms of art and Romanticism for more realistic themes. So realists didn't paint pictures like these. They captured ordinary and everyday activities to express a truthful vision of contemporary life. Realism did spread to a few countries, but its main influence was in France. It emerged in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848 under Napoleon III and the Second Empire. French society was under democratic and social reform, so realism was influenced by the elevation of working class and different political situations. Gustave Courbet was known as the most proudest and arrogant man in France, but he was also the most famous for his style of realism. Some of his most famous pieces include A Burial at Omens, The Stonebreakers, Young Ladies of the Village, and The Painter's Studio. A Burial at Omens was the kickstart to realism. There were those who loved it and found it interesting, and there were those who critiqued it for being ugly because they weren't used to this kind of style. Gustave himself called his piece, A Burial at Omens, the burial of Romanticism. The Stonebreakers was another controversial piece done by Gustave because of his choice in subject, which was interpreted as an anti-authoritarian political threat. This piece was seen as an irony directed against industrialized civilization and how man cannot be freed from harsh work. Young Ladies of the Village also went under much adversity because it went against class distinction and the conventional rules of scale and perspective. This piece shows middle-class women giving charity to the poor. Gustave was showing how the emerging middle class was changing in society. The Painter's Studio was an autobiographical piece of Gustave's. It's him surrounded by groups of friends, patrons, and his models, documenting his artistic and political experiences since the revolutions of 1848. After this piece, A Burial at Omens was rejected by the most famous exhibits in France. Gustave wrote a realist manifesto that echoed the tones of the political manifestos that were going on at the time. Gustave was arrested for his political rebellion, but nonetheless, he was still the major contributor to the development of realism. Jean-François Millet also showed political adversity with his pieces, but his style was more conservative than Courbet's. His most famous pieces include Sheep Shearing Beneath a Tree and The Gleaners. Sheep shearing beneath the tree represented what Millet was influenced by. Most of the French population was migrating to industrialized areas, whereas Millet left Paris and settled to Barbizon, which was much less industrialized. So he drew and painted much landscape and peasant life. The Gleaners is an honest depiction of rural poverty, and it created a scandal because everyone was so class-conscious at the time. Millet wanted to show the struggle of the peasant life that he experienced while he lived in Barbizon. Honoré Daumier was another famous realist who highlighted socio-economic distinctions in the newly modernized urban environment. His two famous contrasting pieces were the first-class carriage and the third-class carriage. There is a clear distinction between these two carriages that Daumier wanted to highlight. In the first-class carriage, there's no connection between the four well-dressed passengers, whereas in the third-class carriage is tightly packed with an anonymous crowd of working-class men and women. Daumier also used contrasting postures, clothing, color, and facial features to show how different the two classes really were. This isn't necessarily vital, so don't feel the need to hurriedly copy this down, but this fellow right here is what led the French from going from realism to impressionism with his piece The Luncheon on the Grass in Olympia. So, what you need to remember is realism rejected idealized classicism and romanticism. It emerged in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848 when the proletariat elevated society, and it captured ordinary and everyday activities that represented what society was becoming and how politics were changing. Also try to remember these famous realists right here. Gustave Courbet, who was the most radical realist since he was willing to express his opinion and was not afraid to be arrested. Jean-Francois Millet, who focused on the country/peasant life. And Honoré Daumier, who focused on the socio-economic differences within France. But all three artists had something to do with the politics and the politic changes and the social changes that were going on. Alright, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you learned something because it took me a really long time to do this.